Hello everyone, and this is NLP Radio on stream again.
Hello.
Today we are having in our studio our usual guest, Alexander Gerasimov, a famous negotiator in Russia, an NLP trainer, trainings of practitioner, NLP master. Geography of seminars and trainings led by Alexander is 22 countries and 70 cities. I am always glad to introduce our guest. Hi, Alexander.
Hello.
Dear listeners, we have learned a lot by American materials of Richard Bandler and Grinder. We have learned and read lots of books, and now we've prepared something to introduce you. Some products you're going to be interested in. Now we'll treat you with something, and the topic discussed today is Metaprograms. The first question, Alexander, what actually is Metaprograms?
Metaprograms are, so to speak, person's habitual ways of thinking, of making a choice, of making a decision. It is what we have had for ages and what is integrated into us rather seriously. For example, all of us have a certain number of metaprograms, and we can choose how many programs we should have independently. For example, we have a metaprogram of motivation. It is what we will be talking about today. And a person habitually picks either motivation of striving for something or motivation of avoiding something. In the form of a metaphor, we can imagine a selector between diametrically opposed positions, either or. For example, a person having a metaprogram of avoiding will be afraid of literally everything, and there is a person having a metaprogram of striving. As a diametrically opposed example for better explanation, a person who is striving for something in spite of everything. I see my target, I believe in myself, I ignore obstacles. Normally, ordinary people are somewhere between these positions, inclined to a certain metaprogram, and there can be a large amount of such habits, metaprograms. I can add a couple of such dichotomies.
I have heard those are about 51 or even more.
I've heard about the book describing 51 metaprograms in NLP by Michael Hall, but I would say that every tool, including for negotiations and for self-improvement, the transformation of quantity into quality occurs, but not always. Sometimes the quantity is so extensive and large that it is not easy to fetch. For example, there is a classification of people comprising 8 personality types, and just imagine a classification comprising 1,000 personality types. When you learn this classification, you won't want to learn any other classifications. And there is an optimal amount of metaprograms. For example, about 10 or 15. I believe that there are 51 metaprograms, but I don't believe that it would be a rather rational tool.
Do we count them in pairs? Do we count number of pairs or altogether?
Pairs.
Active, not active, reflexive types of motivation. I'd like to, at the beginning, I wanted to ask this question in the end, but logically, it's going to be put right here and now. How are they actually formed? And under which circumstances are they formed? And what actually influences their formation?
All of us are products of our childhood. Those are formed including based on our experience and family education, our personal experience, interaction with other people, and in what kind of books and person read in childhood, or in what kind of family a person was brought up. Of course, metaprograms are partially influenced by a physiological component. I mean, There are people, so to say, actually slow naturally. For example, they have such nervous system, slow reaction time. I will name three main metaprograms forming factors. Number one is physiology, human physiology. It's an individual characteristic. We are very different. We have different characters. It was the first factor. Number two is conditions. Conditions in which children are raised in their family. It refers to parents, scenarios, nutrition, and parenting style, and so on. Number three is social interaction. For example, it not necessarily refers to some people, neighbors or friends or schoolmates. It can refer to books which we choose to read consciously. So we have three substantial levels and a combination of those. Well, an earlier level affects a later level and forms the personality of a person. It doesn't mean that a person will be, for example, if it is an avoiding or, for example, a reflexive person, you won't be able to help it. It is possible to adjust, to correct, and then it's the matter of resources you are willing to invest. And it's possible to reformate them, providing that those were formatted.
Okay, I remember in one of your performances, in one of your interviews, you said that imprinted experience play a role.
Yes, I just haven't named this word, and these childhood experiences obtained in childhood when our mental health is the most vulnerable can be called imprints, depending on imprints, including parenting style. For example, a child constantly being hurried by his or her parents, or on the contrary, a baby to whom everyone around, parents, credible people say, don't hurry, weigh everything, check whether you've taken it, recheck. And an initially high-energy child gradually begins to move slower. Sometimes that child is told to stop doing something, sometimes scolded, sometimes praised, and eventually it gets formed. I mean, it has influence. Maybe it is not a key element, and maybe it is impossible to distinguish a key element, but it surely is a component having a certain share of influence.
Right, okay. Now that we have understood actually the basis of their existence, of their appearance, let's talk detailedly about each aspect of motivation. Motivation towards and motivation from, which are pluses and minuses of each in our life.
Well, this is not to say that from motivation is bad and towards motivation is good. It is the matter of applicability. There is a range of peculiarities, or so to say, personality traits. A person having rather from motivation is more cautious, attentive. Such person avoids and doesn't want something to happen. Normally, those people are more observant and more sensitive, unlike towards motivation, where a person is rather result-oriented, and, like they say, an arrow heading towards a target is not distracted by the landscape. So, a person having towards motivation may be insensitive to other people and to their reaction. This is not always the case. There's a certain correlation. For example, I would apply it, positive and negative. If I meet a person rather having from motivation, I would try to match that person's motivation and would talk to a greater extent about problems we should avoid.
Calculating risks.
we would figure out them together, or, for example, a goal-oriented person. It is easier to involve such a person into something. It is easier to offer some prospects, goals, plans to such a person. And he or she will immediately start doing something to achieve a certain goal. Pure from motivation or towards motivation, not that it is difficult to encounter, such people are just rarer. More frequently, it is about balance, about proportions. For example, a person may have 70% of from motivation and 30% of towards motivation. It's rather the question of how it shows itself, how to estimate it in natural environment. Because if we were carrying out some tests, and if a person knew about such tests, he or she could intentionally influence.
This is exactly what I wanted to specify, that it's definitely in the context. It's probably contextual thing, because I know that I am more towards, of course, but not 100% towards. There are definitely contexts where I will not jump immediately to the goal, but I will sit and think. So probably to illustrate somehow in which context, how do we specify it?
First of all, it is the context of interaction with other people. For example, in business, it may be personnel recruiting, and a certain job vacation, a certain occupation, very often towards motivation or from motivation, has an affect. For example, a doctor. A doctor, it is, well, is it towards motivation or from motivation?
That depends on specification, but I believe more from than to.
It is a dentist as a doctor. Earlier it was from motivation. A patient should not have toothache. In recent years, maybe in recent decades, medicine, dentistry becomes more, well, aesthetical, and it is rather towards. You might notice that earlier we associated visiting a dentist with suffering. Nowadays, marketing experts promote dentistry as it is non-painful. It's like we speaking the language of a from motivation, and we say it is not painful. And a beautiful smile, it comprises two motivations, of those avoiding pain and of those willing to look nice at once. And we can define a person's motivation by their wording. Or, for example, risk management. Risk assessment at a company. You can hardly imagine a risk manager who will be striving for something. They will rather be modeling problems and resolve those in their mind. A company's chief security officer, it is also rather from motivation. Nothing should happen than towards motivation. Let us hire more people. And occupation and personnel recruiting is probably the main context of Metaprograms application. And basically, in any communication, it may be the context of attitude, the context of sales, the context of consulting and therapy, and the context of self-development. To understand yourself, you also should be able to distinguish metaprograms in general, and from motivation in particular.
Alexander, to confirm your words, to confirm what you have said, I'd like to come out with an example from my life. When I worked in the United States, I came to be taken to a job, no matter what job, and there was kind of a crowd of applicants, crowd of candidates ready to apply to this job. And after, when they took me, they explained why. They said that we were looking at people sitting there, and all people were taking their phones and preparing for their own presentations, while you were listening attentively to the speaker and asked questions. So you were very active, you were interested, and that was the point why we made the choice. So that was their test. They looked at my behavior. I was really interested, involved, and that was the reason why they took me. So that was a test.
Yes. It is a peculiarity that should be taken into consideration when distinguishing metaprograms. If we inform a person in advance about an upcoming testing, most likely he or she will get prepared to it psychologically. So figuring out not only from or towards metaprograms, it should be as close as possible to the context and the most naturally. In the ideal case, it is just observing a person in natural environment, like some companies do. They have installed CCTV cameras in their waiting room, and they observe a person before that person comes for testing. It also has an effect.
Let's move on to basic emotions of people with these or that characteristics. What are basic emotions? I can guess that maybe motivation 2, people have got anger, or maybe interest. Am I right? Or some other emotions.
Yes.
And motivation from not only fear, but I believe also boredom. Am I right?
Well, if we take boredom as an emotion, it consists of two emotions. It is some kind of a cocktail, the emotion of disgust and the emotion of sadness. If we combine these two chemical elements, we will get a third one named boredom. And disgust is exactly from motivation, avoiding. Of course, there is fear when disgust gets to the active phase. Well, boredom, it is exactly when there is something unpleasant and you don't want it to be, but a person is not always active and has energy to move away from such boredom, from such disgust.
Okay. Now, since we know emotions, since we've got a couple of illustrations, examples already, we are moving closer to how to identify, how to personify, how do we grope in a person? Are there any tests maybe known, calibration, whatever?
From my point of view, the most reliable way is observing a person, because when we invade their privacy, we immediately start influencing them. Moreover, if we tell a person, "We will be testing you right now," like an HR manager recruiting personnel says, "Please, sell me this pen or this calculator," and such person stops being his or her true self. It creates some filters. So when we just place a person into a specific context, some stress preferably, or a person is in some space and we observe them, then first we are able to detect their, leaning direction, the posture. A person having towards motivation will most likely be leaning toward and looking forward and the front of them. A person having from motivation will either look tight or will be leaning aside or backward. Emotion, as we've already said, anger and interest refer to towards motivation, while fear, sadness, and disgust refer to from motivation. Gestures, thrusting away or moving aside gestures correspond to from motivation, while decisive, chopping, forward-directed gestures correspond to towards motivation. We can even, there is no direct correlation, but we can distinguish even judging by clothing or by a person's attitude toward a situation, toward clothing. People inclined to avoid having from motivation, they wear clothes of darker colors, less clean cut, and contrast outfit. People having towards motivation, they wear rather something more bright colored. It is not to say that if a girl wears a bright colored blouse, she has towards motivation. No.
Yeah, not necessarily, of course.
We can just collect more information. The main thing is to a greater extent how a person speaks, provided that that person feels maximum natural and relaxed, A person having towards motivation will be saying words such as to achieve, to obtain, a goal, possession, forward, to move, while a person having towards motivation will use any words and verbs such as to avoid, to take into account.
From, you mean, yeah? Motivation from.
If only that didn't occur, if only we weren't late. These include non, these, last, and other prefixes and suffixes used by a person, or even words such as, for example, dangerous. They are indicators of from motivation. Or the word disgust, for example, refers to from motivation.
Prefixes, yeah? Concentrate on prefixes in the words. Yes. Okay, so now we have understood how we have carried out a few tests. We've got now information about a person. Now, how can we use this information efficiently for our life?
The very first method, I suggest that we should start practicing doing exercises related to this topic. I mean matching a person, matching their perceptual filters, as programs are filters through which we are looking at the world. If the word avoiding is written on a person's filter, it is most likely the world full of hazards. If you start talking about achievements, overcoming, the wish to obtain, and goals being next to such person, he or she won't start moving before having taken all potential hazards into account. If you have figured out that a person has from program, for example, with an 80-20 ratio, I suggest that you should fill your speech, written or oral, with from motivation.
So we need to do matching to a person, tuning up to a person in order to what? Get some results from him, get results that we need from him, right?
It will be matching the deepest habitual ways of thinking. In the deepest levels, habitual ways of thinking. It is matching at the level of person's character. Naturally, if you and another person have similar character traits, that person will most likely prefer to communicate with you. It is an example of how you can use this information.
To persuade him somehow, right?
Yes, we can tell a person about a project putting emphasis exactly on taking hazards into account. We have got that covered. We have taken it into consideration. We have resolved that we will plan it in more detail, and that person will feel more comfortable in our presence. And he or she will pick us if it refers to a business proposal.
Okay.
We can also use it, for example, for the purpose of self-therapy and diagnostics. You surely understand that the most critical thing in our life is a balance. Not to tilt toward a specific metaprogram, but exactly to choose, depending on the context we are currently in. If it is, for example, the context of health, it would be logically, while the idea of health is rather the idea of avoiding problems, of preventing diseases. Because, for example, the World Health Organization doesn't have a definition of a healthy person. Everything is defined through the absence. There is no specific disease. There are no specific symptoms. So, in order to find a healthy person, without knowing how to do it, they haven't set a goal, so they don't reach it. Probably that's the idea. In order to understand whether or not you have balance, whether or not you can be adequate in this context, it is also important, it is critical to know, it is critical to understand ourselves.
Yeah, so when we know ourselves, it means that we can change ourselves. Right? So, yeah, very logical, because when we don't realize something, it guides us, as you always say, right? It guides us. We are in the power of what we cannot realize. So once we realize it, we can change it, I believe, right? Even metaprograms can be changed.
To be more precise, it is not about changing, but rather about shaking them up and balancing. If a person has only from motivation and has no towards programs, we can gently move while practicing towards, to intentionally outline goals, to implement the WFO technique we've practiced. Actually, the WFO technique partially addresses metaprograms. For example, step number 1, setting a goal, corresponds to towards motivation, while ecology, step number 5, corresponds to from motivation. And we should put emphasis exactly on what we really want in order to balance out.
Working with the fears also, I believe. Right?
Accounting fears.
And work with our fears in order to change this metaprogram. In psychotherapy, right?
Yes.
So, using all those tools and instruments, it would be a great idea for a business owner or a company manager who keeps a few employees to manage those employees knowing their metaprograms. Right? Have you ever practiced that? What's your experience with that?
Yes. I consider this information about metaprograms to be very important for distinguishing the type of personality. First of all, if you have for a long time been with a person, for example in a working context, you can understand what kind of person he or she is based on their combination of metaprograms. Let us pretend that you have a list of occupations and job positions available at your company, including corresponding metaprograms. For example, from and towards. And you know that accountant rather refers to from, sales representative rather refers to towards, office cleaner let it be from, and, for example, chief commercial officer refers to both from and towards. And during personnel recruiting or while interacting with already existing employees, you can understand how much a person matches his or her job, because some people, in spite of their character traits, tear themselves literally apart, while personnel reshuffle could be enough. So let people do their own thing. For example, if a person likes accounting risks but is delegated to achieve a breakthrough, to move ahead, such person feels pretty uncomfortable. So let us pretend that you have complied a list of metaprograms, occupations, which, well, available job positions, and you analyze people, and you will realize at once how comfortable a person feels while performing a certain job. Well, as an example.
Yeah, it's a great tool. It's a great tool in NLP. Alexander, I think that you have only woken up, you have only awoken interest to other metaprograms now. Now we have understood how useful it is, what great a tool it is. And in the next podcasts, dear listeners, you should wait. We will highlight other metaprograms. That was light but extremely useful. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you, Olga.
Thank you, Olga. I also would like to ask our listeners to tell us in their comments about their metaprogram ratio and which program prevails within the 1 to 100 range. It could be 80% of towards to 20% of from ratio, or vice versa, 30% of towards to 70% of from, and so on. How do you think, what kind of person are you? And using which parameters can you define it?
I'm sure while you were listening to this podcast, you have already got it in yourself. So please write. Likes and reposts are very welcome, and we hear each other in the next podcast. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.